Welcome to Conversations with the League. This program is produced by the League of Women Voters of the National Capital Area, an organization that works to promote the active and informed participation of citizens in their government. The League, a nonpartisan organization, never supports or opposes a candidate, but we do study issues chosen by our members, arrive at positions as a result of that study, and work to implement those positions. Our interests are broad, covering national, state, regional, and local concerns. I'm Lynn Schuster, your League moderator, and our concern for this program is one of long-standing with the League. It's education, and particularly a look at education in Montgomery County. That indeed is the title of the first paper in a series that has been published by the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, Maryland, and written by Carla Satinsky. Carla is the Director of Education Study for the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, and she's my guest today, and we're going to be looking at education in Montgomery County. Carla, I know you've had a long-standing interest in this, and I was wondering what exactly is the charge that you were given by the League in this look at education?
Well, a year ago, June, we undertook a new study of education in Montgomery County, looking forward to the year 2000 and seeing how education would change in the next 20 years and what our priorities for education might be. Well, when we undertook the study and looked at the population in the schools and the way financing had changed and in fact, the entire public school system had changed, we discovered we really couldn't look forward to the next 20 years without looking backward to the last 20 years. And so we've spent a year trying to review the changes in public education and trying to find why there have been so many changes and
well, I think
sort
that's
of dislocations.
Very interesting, and it would seem to me that what you found and what you've examined for Montgomery County, Maryland, probably would stand true for many suburban areas around these United States, that many of the things at work that brought change to the public school system throughout this past 20-year period really were at work in most suburban areas in this country. I was wondering, where did you start looking? I mean, did people reminisce about what school was like when they attended school?
Yes, in June, we took the study to our members in our June meetings, and we had a start from everybody's high school yearbook, and we discovered we come from lots of places in the United States. But, in fact, in the last generation, schools were very different. Many people attended schools with no blacks. And that was not just in the South. In fact, Midwest and Western people had gone to what amounted to segregated schools. Hardly anybody had a person in their high school graduating class who had a physical handicap. And that was very unusual because if you recall, there used to be a disease called polio, which affected many people. And yet, somehow, once they had a physical handicap, they disappeared. Nobody, just about, had anybody who didn't speak English who graduated with them in public school. And there didn't seem to be any facilities for training people who couldn't speak English. There were very few, if any, retarded people. Nobody knew about learning disabled or other handicaps in terms of learning. Nobody had anybody who was deaf in their high school class or blind. And in fact, we became aware, all of us, when we took a look at what the last generation had done in terms of educating their kids, how different it was today. Because today in the public schools, all of those special populations are in the high schools. And they are intermingled with class instruction. It's called mainstreaming today, where you have children with physical handicaps, you have children who don't speak English very well, you have children with a learning disability.
You have many Hispanic children whose first language is
right.
really Spanish, and
right.
certainly we have our black population in the schools today. And I could see how this really is a different population in the sense that we're serving. I would think, too, thinking about it, that a more difficult population, perhaps, one that needs some special care and attention, and it's perhaps more expensive to service them.
I think that's probably true, and it certainly does need more care and attention, but we did some interviews, one with Darrell Shaw, who was previously a principal in Montgomery County and then served as a member of the Board of Education and finally president of the Board of Education. And he pointed out, as did other people, that teaching is still teaching, and that once these children with some special handicaps are identified and helped, that then it's easier for the teacher to handle them in the classroom. Because many children with learning disabilities or other problems were in the classroom, just a member of the class, and the teacher had no help at all in trying to serve them. So I think it isn't all expense and difficulty. I think there is a certain optimism in terms of serving these special populations, and in fact, I think we saw that there was great hope for the future.
I was wondering, this helped over the last 20 years. Has it come mainly from the federal government, the state government, or has it been really the locality, the local control that has decided to place special programs into the public schools?
There was a great milestone in our country in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, the decision of the Supreme Court in reference to segregated school systems. Before that, education was really very locally controlled, and people somehow had tucked the special populations away, perhaps forgotten them. Many people that in our own league said they never thought about special populations. When they were in school, the fact that these kids weren't there meant that they didn't exist. But in 1954, the federal government, the court, stepped in and said there must be a integrated school system. And they had various basic premises that children who were separated were getting unequal education, period. There was no argument about that according to that decision. That was the first step in the changes. In 1965, the government passed a bill. It was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And probably the most famous part of that act is called Title I. And this had to do with educating disadvantaged children. And the federal government said that they would give money to different school systems throughout the country based on the number of disadvantaged children they have, in order that the children would then, with that extra help supplied by this money, be pulled up to be equal with the rest of the population.
And how did they define disadvantaged, as it were?
Disadvantaged had to do not only with the amount of money that the parents made or didn't make, but with how well the children performed in school. So under Title I, it was necessary to be disadvantaged in terms of academics. You had to be a certain number of years behind in terms of reading or math. Head Start, a probably very familiar program to most of the listeners, came out of this Title I because it was felt that it was too late to start with some of these kids when they were already in kindergarten. You had to start with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, nursery school level. And to many of these children wouldn't have been able to go to nursery school because it would have been an expense and their parents could not have afforded it. Not only did the Head Start work with the kids, it also worked with the parents to try to have them understand what would be important academically to their children. And it's been a very successful program. Long-term studies have found that these kids did improve because of this early start that they had, this Head Start.
Well, when the federal government stepped in and began giving money, I know the court had oversight after Brown versus the Board of Education. I mean, it watched to see that indeed the localities followed through and did desegregate their school systems. But in something like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and Title I, as you say, is the major portion of that. Did Congress feel a need, once it gave the money, to have some strings attached, as it were, to have some oversight?
Well, obviously, when people give money, they have a great interest in making sure it was spent wisely. And it seemed that the way to check on whether the money was spent wisely was to test the children to make sure they had learned what they were supposed to learn and become equal to the rest of the population. And of course, this becomes very difficult in terms of testing because one person feels one thing is important and another feels another. But I think everybody at this point has heard of the minimal. I'm trying to find this on here.
Minimal skills testing?
Yes, the minimal skills or the minimal competency tests. And they are developed and they are being developed in all of the states. And they require that a child be able to read at a certain level and do math at a certain level, to be able to read a want ad, to be able to write a business letter, and various other what are considered to be very minimal requirements.
So survival skills.
Yes. And we have not yet seen what is going to happen with this in terms of whether children who do not pass the tests are going to be then denied a high school diploma, or what will happen to them, because in fact it is possible that not every child will be able to pass this kind of test. It's also true that when you're talking about this minimal competency, you're talking about a very low level of learning that some parents see as a problem in the public schools, that they are coming to stress a very mediocre kind of level of education.
And not going towards those who can excel, not making the course tough enough.
Right. And in fact, standardized testing has that problem because when you have a test for everybody, obviously it has to be at a lower level than if you were only testing the very gifted or very competent students.
I see. And we haven't gotten to the levels where we have testing that would test a minimum competency and then sort of have different levels of achievement tests on top of that.
Well, Montgomery County has standardized tests that are being developed for high school students in all of the academic subjects, final exams. And in English, for example, there are 2 levels of this final examination. However, whether that is enough to test every student in Montgomery County at their own level is certainly questionable. And there are problems that are seen by some parents about this emphasis on testing.
Okay, I gather there's concern about teaching to the test, yes, rather than teaching to learn and internalize skills that one will use later in life.
Problem solving and whatever.
Of course, many areas of the country have had certain kinds of standardized tests for years. I'm thinking of the regents in New York State. And certainly that's been, some of the larger school districts in our country have been there, and those children in great number have learned. learn the skills necessary to make them successful adults later in life. I guess moving along, then we see that federal court decisions. We see Congress getting in the act with Title I. And then I gather around about 1975, Congress acted yet again with the Education for All Handicapped Children Act.
Yes, that was very far-reaching, and a lot of the changes that I described earlier in the public schools came out of that particular act because it included a few very important phrases. First of all, that all handicapped children had to be educated by public expense, and that meant that even if you put them in a private residential program, you had to pay the total costs of that education. In addition, they had in that particular law a phrase that demanded that a child be educated in what was called, quote, the least restrictive environment. And that led inescapably, I think, to the conclusion that these children should be as much as possible in the public schools, which would be considered the least restrictive environment. Now, when you have these special populations in the public schools, you need extra help for the teachers. You need children in the regular classroom being educated about the special problems they'll see. You have special transportation problems for physically handicapped children. You need nurses, perhaps, for care in a regular school. You need special books and methods of teaching for learning disabled children. The emotionally handicapped may be in a regular school but may not be able to eat at the regular time, and so scheduling problems can develop. And we talked about it before. It is expensive. It's particularly expensive in its startup phase because there's a lot of changes that have to be made in education and I guess in-service training for teachers and schools.
Removing architectural barriers
That's
for
right.
handicapped children,
That's right.
for physically handicapped
That's
children
right.
too, I suppose.
Right. And yet, where it's worked, it's been very successful and kind of inspiring. We visited a local elementary school which not only had the ordinary learning disabled children and children who had some difficulty in learning to read and were helped to come back to their classroom up with the rest of the children, but they had a class in there called a satellite program from one of the special schools for moderately retarded children. And these kids, many of whom were very handicapped, retarded children who would never really probably be able to live independently in the community, were in that school. And they ate in the same lunchroom and they walked in the hallways. And the children in the school and the parents of the normal children in the school, by learning that you could sit next to a retarded person, you could talk to them, you could find them an acceptable neighbor in the library, learn to live with these very handicapped individuals.
I guess that comes back to that court decision that said separate isn't equal.
That's right.
That when you put people who are different and give them supposedly the same kind of education, but you keep them all separate, somehow the acceptance, the tolerance, the understanding never has a chance to materialize.
That's right. Of course, it's not only more expensive, it needs the right kind of support system in the schools, and it takes time to develop. But when it is developed, it has proved to be very successful. And
okay, I would like to review some of the numbers because I found them very fascinating in this paper of yours. We all have heard about declining enrollment, and I know schools are closing not only in and around the metropolitan Washington area, but certainly across the country. So your numbers are from 1971, and from 1980. And in 1971, we have a larger number of students in school, and here we're talking about particularly the Montgomery County school system with a total of something like 126,000. And when we get over to 1980, we have 98,800 approximately. And yet the increase in the total number of minority students during that time I found fascinating. I know you have here that 9.1% were minority in 71. In 1980, 21.7 are minority. And then we have with black students in 71, 5.8%. But in 1980, we have 12.1%. With Asian students in 71, we had 1.2%. In 1980, we have 5.7%. I guess we could see the conclusion of the Vietnam War and that whole influx of refugees. And then we have the Hispanic students in 1971 that were 1.9%. In 1980, they're 3.8%. I know you also investigated the number of handicapped children in the school. We were just talking about this education for all handicapped children, the act passing in 1975, and you have here that in 1974 there were 6,000 children in the public school who were classified as handicapped. But by 1980 there were 10,626. So we really can see a decreasing enrollment, but an increase in these special populations.
That's right. The handicapped population probably has gone up partly because we are identifying more children at the moment. That some of these handicapped children may just have been considered bad or
slow,
lazy. Yes. The child who didn't learn to read in the ordinary way in first grade may have had a problem seeing the letters, but no one recognized it. And now parents expect that their children will learn, and they don't want to hear that it's impossible to teach them because they don't sit still in class. And so I'm not sure that the handicapped population didn't exist earlier. It's just that we didn't recognize some of them, and we didn't care to teach them in a special way. As far as the minority enrollment, we probably have not seen the end of the increase in minorities in this area. Washington, D.C. is a national capital, and as whenever there are dislocations in the world, there's an influx of refugees, and many of them settle in this area. And we are not alone. Now, our numbers may be different here. For example, Hispanic students are at the bottom in terms of minorities that are listed. In some states, they are at the top of the minorities that are listed. The same thing is true in terms of other kinds of special populations. But
certainly the need for bilingual education or some kind of teaching of children who have another language as their first language is...
Yeah, it may be interesting to you to know there are 70 different languages spoken in Montgomery County, aside from English. And these kids are all over the county. We don't have bilingual education as such. We have something called ESOL, which is English for Speakers of Other Languages. And we have intensive work with these children to teach them to speak English. Every school that has this kind of program, and practically every school has it, has a specialized teacher that not only works with the children, but also works with the teachers, because some of these children come from societies that have a different kind of moray system than we have. And, for example, the elementary school teacher who thinks that a child is unwilling to participate because the child won't look at her, finds that in the society from which that child comes, it is impolite to look at an adult. And so Once a teacher understands this, the teacher is much better able to work with the child and doesn't feel that the child is being sneaky or offensive. And that's why these teachers, these ESOL teachers, are very valuable, not only to teach the kids, but to work with the teachers.
And to help socialize everyone to the
right.
customs and what's expected.
You can see how very different school is today. We went to this elementary school. They have this ESOL teacher. They have a speech therapist. They have a reading teacher. They have a special education teacher to work with kids in the regular classes to help them to come up to grade level. You have special education teachers to work in separate classrooms with the children, as well as your first grade and second grade and third grade teacher. And the face of the public schools today is not the same as it was in 1954 or when at least I went to public school.
Hey, I was wondering about expectations for the 20 years into the future. I know this is just the start, really, of your look at that, but I gather with this kind of perspective on the past and how it has changed, it makes you have some new thoughts about the future and what the public school should be for the future, because I'm wondering, we haven't discussed at all private education. I know in our time is running down, but as some of these other populations have entered the public school system, some of those students who are, quote, considered normal, and perhaps we're feeling that there is too much emphasis on these special populations, have been leaving the public school system.
Yes. That is a problem and is, I think, something that will have to be dealt with in the next 20 years because many of the special programs that came by way of law and regulation were funded, at least in part, by the federal or state government. That may be changing because of the way the funds will be distributed in the future. And instead of coming specifically to disadvantaged children or to handicapped children, these funds may be in the form of something called a block grant, which is just general funds and with no earmarks on it.
Okay, well, we'll have to be watching for that
Yes.
in the future because our time is running out, and I think
Yes.
that this is something we'll have to have Carla Satinsky from the Montgomery County League of Women Voters back to discuss. We'll have to see block grants versus categorical grants in education. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation with the League of Women Voters. For additional information about this program or about the League, you may call the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, Maryland at 984-9585, 984-9585. For Lynn Schuster, thank you.